out on these issues, even while we acknowledge that conditions have not changed much for journalists on the ground. But there has been one issue around which it has been difficult to engage with the UN, and that is the unjust imprisonment of journalists around the world. That is because governments are directly responsible for these grave abuses, and the UN has a culture of rarely calling out its members. But the jailing of journalists has reached unprecedented levels. At the end of last year, there were 262 journalists jailed around the world, the highest number ever recorded by CPJ. The jailing of journalists is a brutal form of censorship that is having a profound impact on the flow of information around the world. The time has come to speak out and to name names. At the end of last year, Turkey was the world's leading jailer of journalists, with 73 journalists behind bars. China was second with 41, followed by Egypt with 20. Together, these three countries jail 134 journalists, which is more than all the other countries of the world, all the journalists that are in prison in all the other countries of the world. But at today's event, we want to talk not just about the numbers. We want to talk about the journalists themselves. The journalists, the entire 5 case journalists come from Bangladesh, Kyrgyzstan, Egypt, and Myanmar. I want to start with the Reuters reporters Wa Lone and Kwa So-u, who are jailed in Myanmar. These 2 journalists have been sentenced to 7 years in prison on retaliatory charges for violating Myanmar's colonial-era official secrets. Has the right to seek and receive information through any medium and regardless of frontiers. But how can we do so when the people who are informing us are imprisoned for their efforts? As world leaders gather here in New York this week for the UN General Assembly, this issue needs to feature agenda. In a moment, Stephen Adler, President and CEO of Reuters, and Amal Clooney, who is representing Wa Lone and Kwa So-u, will say more. But first, let's watch a short video about these 2 brave journalists.
On September 3rd, 2018, a Myanmar judge found 2 Reuters journalists guilty of breaching a state secrets law. Wa Lone and Cha So-u face 7 years in prison. They were arrested after uncovering a mass killing in Myanmar, which the authorities later acknowledged did happen. In August 2017, a military crackdown began in western Myanmar that has since sent 700,000 Rohingya, a Muslim Bangladesh. During the crackdown, 10 Rohingya were killed by security forces and Buddhist villagers. Wa Lone and Cha So-u investigated that massacre. A village elder gave them 3 photos. The first 2 showed 10 Rohingya Muslims and boys kneeling on September 1st, and then the following day. The third showed them in a pit, hacked and shot to death. The reporters verified the story not only with Muslims fleeing Myanmar, but also with Buddhists and members of the security forces. However, before they could publish their report, they were detained during an arranged meeting with police officers. For the next 2 weeks, they disappeared without a trace, leaving Wa Lone's wife, Pan E, desperate for news. The reporters remained in custody for months up to and during their trial. During that time, Pan E gave birth to the couple's first child. Cha Sang-woo has a 3-year-old daughter with his wife, Chit Soo-win. He's already missed many milestones in her young life. After their arrest, Wallon and Cha Sang-woo were put in black hoods and taken to a secret camp where they were interrogated, threatened, and denied sleep for 3 days. After 2 weeks, they were transferred to Myanmar's notorious insane prison. Nonetheless, with their support, Reuters published their report on the massacre. The shocking evidence they'd found was indisputable. Myanmar authorities acknowledged that the massacre had happened even as they prosecuted the reporters. Their trial and sentencing has sparked a global outcry, not least among colleagues. Reuters president and editor-in-chief Stephen J. Adler.
We view this as a wholly unwarranted, blatant attack on press freedom.
Rights groups and governments have called for the release of the 2 reporters. Journalists in Myanmar and around the world have protested the court's judgment. But Myanmar's civilian leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, has defended the conviction of Wallon and Cha Sang-woo.
It's not a matter of they were not jailed because they were journalists. They were jailed because the court sentence has been passed on them because the court has decided that they had broken the Official Secrets Act.
The families of the 2 reporters have appealed to Myanmar's authorities for their release. For young people in Myanmar, like Wallon and Cha Sang-woo, Aung San Suu Kyi's sweeping election win in 2015 sharpened the hunger for freedom in Myanmar after decades of brutal military rule. It's part of what drove the pair to become journalists, to serve the public by finding out the facts that form the bedrock of the rule of law in a democracy. While providing that service, Wallon and Cha Sang-woo were wrongfully imprisoned and separated from their families. Wallon and Cha Sang-woo and Reuters will continue to fight for their freedom.
ဒီကျွန်တော်သမီးလေးပြောမတက်တင်ထားပဲပေါ့နော်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာပေါ့နော်ဒီလိုအမတ်တရားတွေကိုဖော်ထုတ်တဲ့လူတွေကဒီအကျဉ်းထောင်တွေအထက်မှာနေနေရတယ်ဆိုတာကိုလေကျွန်တော်သမီးလေးပြောအောင်ပေါ့နော်သူကြည့်လိုက်ရင်သူချက်တောင်
Good morning. I'm Steve Adler, editor-in-chief of Reuters. It was a year ago this month that those 10 Muslim men and boys you just saw were brutally murdered in the village of Indin in Myanmar's Rakhine State. They were picked out of a crowd by paramilitary forces sent to secure the village in the midst of what the UN has described as ethnic cleansing. The oldest was 45, the youngest only 17. They were bound, made to kneel, led up a hill, hacked with swords, and shot to death. Their bodies were thrown into that one shallow grave. We have seen the awful photographs and know about the massacre because of the intrepid reporting of those 2 courageous journalists, Wallon and Cha Sang-woo. They work for Reuters, the news organization that I run. We know about the massacre because they did what good reporters do. They talked to their sources. They traveled to the location of a suspected incident. They spoke with witnesses of all backgrounds, interviewed officials, collected documentary evidence, and viewed the crime scene themselves. We know about the massacre in short because Wallon and Cha Sang-woo went to Indin with open minds and left with facts. Except they didn't really get to leave, did they? Only the facts did. In an astonishing miscarriage of justice, our reporters were set up and arrested. A brigadier general who was angry that members of his command had talked to Wallone was behind the plan. The trap was simple, almost absurd. On December 12th, Wallone was summoned by police to an urgent meeting at a restaurant. There, he and his colleague, Cha So-u, were given documents rolled up in a newspaper and instructed to read them later. Then, when they left the restaurant, they were pounced on by police, who pretended to discover those very same documents. Their arrest was clearly aimed at unmasking Reuters sources and preventing us from publishing the account of the massacre. Intimidation was severe. Our reporters were handcuffed, hooded, continuously interrogated, threatened, and denied sleep. 2 weeks passed before their families, lawyers, or we at Reuters had any idea where they were. But once we'd made contact with them and completed their reporting, we published the explosive story of what happened at Indin. We published those photographs, too. Wallone and Cha So-u gave us their full support in doing so. They wanted that story out. They are good men, devoted, hardworking husbands and fathers, though Wallone has yet to see his 1-month-old daughter, and Cha So-u has managed only brief hugs with his 3-year-old. More to the point, these men are patriotic citizens who want to see their country act morally and move closer to the rules-based democracy promised by Aung San Suu Kyi. Both chose journalism with a sincere belief that they could advance these goals by impartially uncovering facts and telling the truth. Both men embody what Reuters has made its mission for more than 160 years, to be strenuously impartial in our gathering of information. Reuters is known for its determination to report the facts, whatever they are and whomever they favor or offend. In the 166 countries where we operate, we remain committed to that goal, including in Myanmar, where our reporting continues. And make no mistake, what's happening in Myanmar and in the Rohingya refugee camps across the border in Bangladesh is vitally important to everyone in the world. And we will not be intimidated from pursuing these stories, despite the unjust prosecution of our journalists, and despite the fact that Myanmar's military has since imposed more restrictions on coverage of Rakhine State. However, the mistreatment of Wallone and Cha So-u is not just about these two reporters, or about Reuters, or even about Myanmar. The attack on them is a chilling warning to other journalists worldwide. Myanmar is not the only country where attempts are made to deter investigative news gathering, scare sources and whistleblowers, dim the spotlight of reporting, and thereby allow officials to act in darkness with impunity. The community of nations cannot condone this. We must stand for the rule of law, for the ideal and the practice of democracy, and those cannot flourish without the free flow of information. I want to say that we're grateful for all those who have stood by Wallone and Cha So-u for all this time. Our staff at Reuters, journalists around the world, press freedom groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists, governments and diplomats, multinational organizations, and countless individuals, many of whom I see in this room. Wallone and Cha So-u were unjustly arrested, unjustly convicted, and unjustly sentenced. They should not be in prison for another day. And we will continue to advocate on their behalf until they are free. Thank you. And please welcome our next speaker, Amal Clooney, counsel to Wallone and Cha So-u.
Good morning, everyone. As we are gathered here today, 2 innocent men are in prison in Myanmar for doing nothing more than tell. Wallone and Cha So-u, for almost a year, have been separated from their young families and paraded into a courtroom for a sham trial. Their conviction and draconian 7-year sentence are a travesty of justice, and it is up to the government to set them free. The prosecutor's story, accepted wholesale by the court, is not only fabricated, but totally implausible. They ask you to believe that Wallone and Cha So-u happened to be walking down the road one evening last December, carrying top-secret documents in their hands, when suddenly they were stopped at a vehicle checkpoint for looking suspicious. According to this account, police were shocked to find these documents on Wallon and and in the spur of the moment decided to arrest them for being spies. It was simply a coincidence, we are told, that right at this time, Wallon and Chassaou were working on a story about the brutal execution of 10 Rohingya men in Rakhine State, where the UN says Myanmar's security forces are committing the gravest crimes under international law. Of course, what really happened is that officials found out about the story and didn't want it to come out. So police planted government documents on the journalists while other officers lay in wait outside to arrest them. The journalists were arrested and were then prosecuted and subjected to a show trial in which their conviction was guaranteed. Let me highlight just 3 reasons why their trial was a miscarriage of justice. First, the prosecution's own witnesses have contradicted their case. A senior police officer who was expected to repeat the prosecution's lies shocked observers when in a packed courtroom he announced he felt compelled to preserve the integrity of his profession and tell the truth. He gave explosive testimony in open court, confirming that he heard a brigadier general from the police tell his subordinates to plant official documents on Wallon and then arrest him or face jail time themselves if they refused. After his heroic testimony, he was himself sentenced to 1 year in prison, and he's still in prison today. Other prosecution witnesses fell apart one by one on the stand. One witness literally read notes written on his hand to try and remember what he was supposed to say. Another was asked to provide his notes from the arrest, but said he had burnt them. Prosecutors claimed they could not locate a key witness, even though he was in detention at the time. And during police questioning, the officers didn't even pretend to be interested in the documents they had seized. Instead, they asked obsessively about who the journalist sources were in Rakhine and why they, as Buddhists, would even bother exposing crimes against Rohingyas. They even proposed to drop the charges if Reuters agreed to drop the story. Their offer was declined, but their own words made clear that their goal was always to bury the story. Second, there was a conviction without proof of a crime. A conviction under the Official Secrets Act requires that someone collected or shared material with intent to prejudice the state. But the documents that were in the journalists' hands when they were arrested were not state secrets. They were actually not even secret. And the journalists did not seek to harm the state. They were simply doing their job. But the judge entered a conviction anyway, because Wallon's old notebook included the phone number of a member of the Arakan Army, an armed group that Wallon was reporting on when he worked for the Myanmar Times. The judge could not point to any contact with this phone number, but found that the journalist was still guilty because, quote, the number was evidence that, quote, there are opportunities for the defendants to transmit security information to anti-government groups. Opportunities. Well, how convenient. Instead of the prosecution having to prove guilty conduct beyond doubt, the defense has to prove that such conduct is not theoretically possible. That makes this a conviction without a crime. Third, the trial violated every meaningful right to due process. The court was clearly not independent or impartial. How could a fair-minded judge convict on this evidence? The journalists were not given sufficient information about the charges. They were denied access to key evidence. They were questioned for weeks without a lawyer present. They were brought to a secret interrogation center. They were held incommunicado. They were hooded, forced to kneel, dragged on the floor, and denied sleep, and pressured to sign statements against their will. Exculpatory evidence was hidden or destroyed. Most fundamentally, there was no presumption of innocence, rather a predetermination of guilt. And you don't need to take my word for it. Every single observer of this trial has agreed that it was a farce. In Myanmar, young people took to the streets to protest the conviction. The Press Council and 83 civil society groups criticized the judgment. Senior members of the governing party called the prosecution unfair, and local media published blacked-out front pages in solidarity with the two journalists. Across the region, press associations and parliamentarians from Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia, the Philippines, and Indonesia all condemned the verdict. And around the world, officials from the United Nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, the EU, Canada, Australia, and Bangladesh, newspapers including the Washington Post, the New York Times, The Economist, and Le Monde, as well as every major free press NGO in the world, agree that this conviction is a travesty of justice. So, what can now be done? For months, Myanmar's government has been asked this question, and they've replied, well, the case is in the courts. There's nothing we can do to intervene. Well, now it's not in the courts, and they can intervene. Under Article 204 of Myanmar's constitution, the president can grant a pardon at any time after a conviction. He does so following consultation with Myanmar's leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, who said on her first day in office that it was her priority to release prisoners of conscience. The journalists' families have already submitted a pardon request, and in previous cases, a pardon has been granted as soon as 4 days following a conviction. This case began with authorization from the government at the highest level, all the way up to the president's office, and the government can, if it wants to, end it today. But earlier this month, Aung San Suu Kyi defended this prosecution and challenged anyone who has read the judgment to explain what was wrong with it. In her words, if anybody feels there has been a miscarriage of justice, I would like them to point it out. Well, my remarks today are intended to answer Aung San Suu Kyi's call, and indeed, as counsel to Reuters and the two journalists, it is my duty to do so. But Aung San Suu Kyi has herself spoken of the need for a free press if Myanmar is to transition to a full democracy. She has praised the value of journalism in revealing wrongdoing and said that freedom begins with freedom of speech. She knows that mass murder is not a state secret and that exposing it doesn't turn a journalist into a spy. She is the Nobel Peace Prize winner whose name was whispered in the halls of St. Hugh's College, Oxford, where she and I both studied. When I was a student, she was a hero to me, as she has been to so many human rights advocates around the world and to so many of the 50 million people in Myanmar whose lives she promised to change. She allowed young people to hope for a free Myanmar that respected the rule of law, and her own life story made them believe that it was possible. Aung San Suu Kyi knows better than anyone what it is like to be a political prisoner in Myanmar. She has slept in a cell at the prison where Walloon and Chasau now sleep. But today, she holds the key to their liberty, the key to reuniting them with their young children, the key to freedom of the press, the key to truth and accountability, and the key to a more democratic and prosperous Myanmar. History will judge her on her response. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amal. Thank you, Steve. The list of journalists jailed around the world is long. In fact, it's never been longer. But I want to focus now on 3 other journalists from that list who, like Walloon and Chau So-u, are unjustly jailed in reprisal for reporting on stories of global significance. Shahidul Alam is a renowned photojournalist, commentator, and founder of a Bangladeshi multimedia organization. His photographs of street life, political protest, and Bangladesh's ecological challenges have captivated his country and the world. Last month, Shahidul was arrested while covering student protests in Bangladesh. A day later, A Dhaka court ordered that he be held for 7 days to determine if he had violated Section 57 of the Information and Communication Technology Act by spreading propaganda and false information. When Shahidul was brought into court, he screamed that he had been tortured. He was unable to walk without assistance. Nearly 2 months later, he remains behind bars. As with Wallon and Chao So-u, Shahidul's case is rife with due process violations. The American Bar Association Center for Human Rights released a report that concluded the entire criminal process, this is in quotes, the entire criminal process against Dr. Alam has been only a means of intimidation and retaliation and a gross subversion of Bangladesh's justice system. And I have just learned that Shahidul's family is here with us, and I'd like you to stand, please. Please stand up. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you so much. Can I just say this is the kind of support, the kind of response we need from the international community to resolve these terrible cases of injustice. And I want to make a point. Around the world, 52% of all journalists in prison are in jail for reporting on human rights violations. I want to talk about another one. Azimjan Askarov, he's another example. He's a journalist and human rights defender from Kyrgyzstan who has been sentenced to spend the rest of his life in jail. He has already been in prison since July 2010. Askarov's crime, covering deadly ethnic clashes between Kyrgyz and Uzbeks in southern Kyrgyzstan in the summer of 2010. During his trial, Askarov and his lawyer were both assaulted. Exculpatory testimony from his wife and neighbors was ignored. CPJ conducted its own investigation into the case in 2012 and found that charges against Askarov were in retaliation for his reporting on corrupt and abusive practices by regional police and prosecutors. Askarov himself told CPJ that authorities had long threatened him, probably because he had exposed fabricated criminal cases, arbitrary detentions, and the rape and abusive treatment of detainees in his native Jalalabad region. The UN Human Rights Committee looked into Askarov's case and found that numerous violations took place between the day of his arrest and sentencing. In early 2016, that body called on Kyrgyzstan to release Askarov. This summer, CPJ asked for permission to visit Askarov in prison. The Kyrgyz government said no. Today, we are calling on President Jeenbekov to use his authority to free Askarov and unequivocally commit to protecting press freedom. We call on member states to insist that President Jeenbekov and the Kyrgyz government comply with the recommendations of the UN Human Rights Committee. I want to turn to another country and another case. It's beyond sad that repression continues to mount in Egypt. Since 2013, that country has been among the world's worst jailers of journalists, according to CPJ research. Of the 20 journalists in Egyptian jails last year, some have faced politically motivated anti-state charges, but others face charges for publishing false news. Among them is Aleh Abdulfetteh, a prominent blogger and activist who has written about politics and human rights for numerous outlets. Aleh is serving a 5-year prison sentence on charges that he organized a protest and assaulted a police officer. We believe the charges are trumped up and in retaliation for Aleh's coverage of alleged human rights abuses committed by the police themselves and the security forces. We hope that Aleh will be released soon. But when that day comes, his ordeal will not be over because of draconian parole conditions that will require him to spend each night in a local police station. Photojournalist Mahmoud Abu Zayed, known as Shao Khan, is an object lesson in the absurdity of the Egyptian criminal justice system. Shao Khan was arrested in 2014 and held for 5 years without charge. He was recently convicted and sentenced to time served, but he has still not been released. Governments around the world routinely use emergency laws to censor media outlets and publications. Increasingly, they also bring fake news charges against journalists who contradict official statements. They try journalists in military courts. They hold them in pretrial detention indefinitely. These are all actions that contradict international human rights law and the standards set by the UN. Few countries have been held to account for their repressive practices. One of the reasons is that key international bodies like the United Nations and its member states follow a diplomatic protocol and refuse to name names. Even leading democracies abide by this custom. Why are they afraid to stand up for their values? The General Assembly must be more than a parade of speeches. The UN has taken action on the issue of journalist safety through a series of resolutions, a plan of action, and the engagement of the Secretary General's office. We are very grateful for these efforts. But today, we are asking the UN to expand its engagement in response to the record number of journalists imprisoned around the world. And we are asking member states that support press freedom to speak out about these abuses and to demand answers. The jailing of journalists around the world is successfully censoring coverage of key global issues and violating our collective right to seek and receive information vital to public understanding. This is an issue that the UN can no longer ignore. And now we are happy to take your questions, all of us. My colleague, Courtney Raj, she's over there. She's going to moderate. I ask only one thing. Please be brief, and by brief, I mean around a minute. And we will be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to call on the permanent representative from the UK, of the UK, the Honourable Alistair Burt, Minister of State for the Middle East and North Africa, and the Minister of State at the Department for International Development, to make a brief remark.
Thank you very much, and to Steve, Joel, and Amal, thank you very much for leading this and for the efforts of those who've convened it. It's much appreciated by the UK government. My Prime Minister, Theresa May, said something in the chamber earlier this week that bears repeating. She said, and I quote, "Like many leaders, I suspect I do not always enjoy reading what the media in my country writes about me to write, but I will defend their right to say it, for the independence of our media is one of my country's greatest achievements. It is the bedrock of our democracy." It's uncomfortable for us, and sometimes it's uncomfortable for our friends, because this issue knows no boundaries. Because freedom of expression is not just a fundamental right in itself. It also underpins good governance, public accountability, and respect for all human rights. That was a quote from the Commonwealth Principles on Freedom of Expression and the Role of the Media, which was launched by the Commonwealth Association of Journalists at the Heads of Government meeting in April. It highlights the role of a free and independent media in holding those in power to account. This is why press freedom is so essential to democracy. Yet, as we've heard, it's under threat in many places. Journalists are threatened, intimidated, or attacked. Hundreds are in detention. And in the first half of this year alone, 47 have been killed. This is totally unacceptable. And the United Kingdom calls on all states to create an environment in which journalists can work in safety. Respect for fundamental freedoms and the rule of law is something that British ministers regularly raise with governments around the world. When our Foreign Secretary met Aung San Suu Kyi last week, he expressed concern at the convictions of the Reuters journalists of Walloon and Chassou, and urged Burma to respect freedom of expression and rule of law. I raised concerns about freedom of expression with the government of Bangladesh in July and encouraged them to engage with civil society to address concerns over the Information and Communications Technology Act. We remain concerned about the mass arrest of student demonstrators. We've also asked the Egyptian authorities to release journalists and political detainees, to review mass judicial decisions, and to remove restrictions on civil society. This meeting, this body, the response of this audience to the families of those caught up in this, speaks volumes and demonstrates still the ability of this place to command collective action to do something about it. The United Kingdom will continue and to promote and defend freedom of expression and a free and independent media as an essential part of a secure and prosperous democratic body throughout the world. Those of us close to journalists, either through our roles and sometimes through our families, owe these brave people no less and will continue to promote their freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd now like to call on the permanent representative from Germany.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I would like to commend you for being here today and giving your support to the very noble cause. Germany has always supported all the UN General Assembly resolutions that deal with the freedom of media. And we have been elected for the Security Council and will be there in 2019 and 2020. And in our campaign, we clearly said that for us, human rights will be very important. Human rights and security will be a very important item, and we want to put that on the agenda. We said that before the election, and then we were voted with 184 out of 190 votes. So we will have the legitimacy also to raise that in the Security Council. On the campaign here, I can only echo what speakers have said. Germany also supports the appeal to Aung San Suu Kyi to grant pardon to the journalists. And we also support, of course, the drive towards giving freedom to all the journalists that are behind bars. We had today in Germany President Erdogan and the Chancellor in her talks also openly demanded the freedom for journalists, and we have many Turkish journalists in Germany right now who had to flee Turkey because they were not allowed to do their job there, are threatened to be put behind bars because in some cases they did something similar as the journalists did in Myanmar. They wrote about something that was done and where the government didn't want this to come to the public. So freedom of press is core of the human rights. We will defend that, and we have to note that we have these record numbers of people being behind bars. The criticism of the media worldwide, the independence of media is put under question. You have sometimes even selection of journalists who are allowed for a press conference and things like this. I think we have to fight this, and Germany will do that. Thank you.
Thank you. I would now like to call on the permanent representative from Lebanon to make a brief remark.
I'm sorry, I came here not prepared because I was in another meeting, but I'm going to say some remarks, and I will start them with the personal experience. As a young student in Lebanon in the 80s, a formative experience really taught me a big lesson. At that time, Salim Lawzi, who was a journalist and owner of a magazine, was kidnapped and killed in Lebanon. But that was not the worst part of it. The worst part was they poured acid on his right hand. And at that time, journalists used to write with longhand. They did not have laptops and computers. That was a message to all the journalists in Lebanon and the Arab world, that this is what happens to you if you use your right hand. I went on and I became a journalist, but this was the most difficult experience for me as a young journalist, and I'll never forget that. And this brought me now, when I knew this meeting is happening, to tell you that despite of all the problems that we have in Lebanon, we're still one of the most freest countries in terms of free press. We're not perfect, but we are doing a very good job compared to everybody. And we support the free press. It's part of our constitution, it's part of our culture and our life. And I support all the people who are here, your cause, and I hope that we reach a day when journalists will not be killed, imprisoned, and their right hands will not be burned. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now we'd like to open up the floor to Q&A. If you're interested in raising a question, please push the silver button, and then I will call on you and recognize you. And if you could please identify yourself as well before asking the question. And again, please do keep it brief. I see first here in the back. Please go ahead. You? Yes.
Again. Virginia Jeffries from CUNY Graduate School of Journalism and the New York City News Service. My question is for Amal Clooney and Joel Simon in particular. After the sentencing, we saw a lot of people, private organizations, as you mentioned, like the New Yorker, ProPublica, Time Magazine, make semi-official statements of solidarity on social media. And I'm wondering, is that best for them, or is that going to come back to bite them later? Will it be distorted? I know that there sort of seem to be building a case that they've been sent by international bodies trying to subvert the Burmese government. What is this good for them? Should we do that?
Hi, thank you for the question. I think responsible reporting about the verdict is absolutely helpful and appropriate, and certainly we would never seek to stop it anyway. I think, they would be heartened to know, the two journalists sitting in prison are heartened to know that they're getting this kind of response from other fellow journalists around the world, and as long as the commentary is accurate, then I think it's absolutely appropriate and helpful too.
I'll say a word, and maybe, Steve, you want to also comment. I think that, when journalists are in prison for their work, that's a time when the entire profession needs to stand together and speak out. And so I think it's welcome. And I have a lot of experience, too much experience over many years, of talking to journalists who've been imprisoned. And one of the things that sustains them is this kind of public outcry from their colleagues. So I think it accomplishes two things. I think it's the right thing to do for journalists and media organizations, and I think it's a powerful message of support for the journalists who are imprisoned and who are isolated and alone.
Just to add that the most important thing journalists can do to honor other journalists in prison is to do good, factual, honest journalism. So to continue reporting on what's happening not only in Myanmar, but every place else in the world, it really does honor those journalists. And I think it was particularly significant that Wallone and Jossou were so passionate about our going ahead, finishing their reporting, and writing the story about that massacre, because the whole point is not us, it's reporting the facts and letting the world know about them.
I saw that there was a hashtag online, which was Arrest Me Too, that other journalists said, well, if what they've done is a crime, then what every journalist does is a crime, because all they did was, follow the evidence, follow leads, ask questions from all sides, and then report what they learned and report the truth. So I think, that is true, and the solidarity there is important. And it's also why, as Steve said, this isn't just a case about two men. This is a case about the ability of any journalist in Myanmar and further afield to report, because the reason governments take on these cases is because they want them to have a chilling effect. So not only do they bury one story, but then they, the rest of the journalistic community will start to self-censor, and we've seen that in many countries around the world. So just to echo what my colleagues are saying, I think it is actually incredibly important.
Thank you. Before continuing on to questions, I'd just like to invite the Ambassador for Human Rights of France to make a brief intervention.
Thank you very much. My name is François Croquette. I'm the French Ambassador for Human Rights. I would just like to thank the organizers for this meeting. It is very important, we believe, that we address the case of this journalist within the framework of the General Assembly. As you know, France has condemned the sentencing of the two journalists from Reuters, Wallon and Kwao-Soou, to 7 years. These sentences, we believe, are a serious attack on freedom of press and the rule of law in Burma. France repeats its call for their release and for their fundamental rights to be respected, and of course for the media to be given free access to the Rakhine State. During this meeting, France co-hosted a ministerial meeting on Monday on Burma, during which their case was addressed. We also have launched an initiative for the protection of journalists worldwide, and I would like to recall that the French daily newspaper Le Monde has published the report of Wallon and Kwao-Soou front page, and that the campaign in France for their release will continue until it has been achieved. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite the U.S. Ambassador to ECOSOC, Elizabeth Curry, to make a brief intervention.
It's already, oh, there we go. Thank you. First, I would love to thank Reuters and the Committee to Protect Journalists and the panelists for convening this important meeting today. On behalf of the U.S. mission to the United Nations and Ambassador Haley, I want to express our continued support for the release of Wallon and Kwao-Soou. These two journalists were just doing their job, as has been amply stated today, and journalism is not a crime. Doing good journalism should never be a crime, and we stand in solidarity with them and their families and the other journalists who have been unjustly detained around the world. Ambassador Haley has spoken out very strongly on this case, both publicly and directly with the authorities of the Burmese government, and will continue to do so. And we will continue to highlight their case as one of the most egregious examples of oppression of freedom of the press and freedom of expression in the world today. Further to that, I would like to highlight an initiative that the United States will be taking this fall in the General Assembly in the Third Committee to submit a new resolution on freedom of association and assembly. And in this resolution, we will specifically highlight the need to protect media workers who are covering protests, who are meeting with dissidents, and who are bringing to attention the voices of those who oppose authoritarian, semi-authoritarian, and governments that are sliding into authoritarianism, whether they're democratic on the surface or otherwise. We are looking forward to working with other member states here at the UN to support this new resolution in the Third Committee, and we welcome the different delegations that are here today to reach out to us to work with us on this resolution. We think it's very important to highlight the role that media workers in particular play, not only in protecting freedom of expression, but also protecting the other fundamental freedoms of association and assembly by covering when others are protesting, covering when others are speaking out against injustice. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to once again open it up for questions, and I'd actually also encourage you to raise your hand because it's a little bit hard to see the green lights. And I'd like to first ask that members of the media who are here to ask questions, we're going to take your questions first and then open it up more broadly. So I see a question back there on the 1, 2, 3, 4 rolls in, I believe, with the Wall Street Journal. Press your button one more time so it's red.
Hi there, my name is Jay Conti. I'm the general counsel from the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones. I'd first just like to applaud Reuters and its counsel for its full-throated defense of their two reporters. It's really admirable the lengths that you all have gone to support your folks who are in prison, and we clearly support you. It's a travesty, and the case is tough to watch and to follow. And in this scenario, I imagine your objective has to be getting them out of prison as quickly as possible. But my one question for you is, by asking for a pardon, are you concerned that some could interpret that as conceding guilt?
Thanks very much for the question, and I think it's an important question because it can be misunderstood. We have supported the family's request for a pardon because at this moment that is the only way for them to be free. The families in their pardon request have made clear that their husbands, the request comes from the two wives, that their husbands did not commit a crime and that they're not guilty of any crime. But at this point, the case is no longer in the courts and it's squarely in the lap of the government. And the government can issue a pardon, as I said in my earlier remarks. So we're appealing to that process because it's the only way for part of the injustice to be remedied, the part that is about them being imprisoned. Obviously, the actual, full remedy that we would wish for is for an acknowledgement that they never committed a crime, for their conviction to be cancelled. But for the time being, this is the mechanism under Myanmar law by which we can get them released, and obviously we're going to pursue it as enthusiastically as we can at this juncture.
Thank you. I see a question from the media up. Yes, with your hand raised. Thank you. Please identify yourself.
Can't get the red. There we go. Hi, Kristen Salumi from Al Jazeera here. I know in Myanmar, Facebook came under a lot of pressure for allowing hate speech to, and people associated with the military to have accounts on Facebook. I'm wondering how you reconcile free speech rights on social media with the rights of journalists. Is there a tension there, and how do you reconcile that? Yes, that's my question. Thanks.
I think one way to think about it is when we engage with Facebook and with social media companies, we engage on both sides of this issue. So sometimes our concern is that particular actionable threats are being made against journalists, and so our concern is that this content be removed. And other times, that same framework is used to actually remove critical and valid journalistic speech. So there's no question that it's a difficult issue, and I think that the companies, frankly, have to have both responsibilities. I mean, they have to figure out a way to keep speech that actually endangers people, and in the case you mentioned, actually can inspire mass violence, and they have to figure out a way to do that while preserving fundamental right to free expression and the rights of journalists to report the news. So I'm not going to give you an easy formula, but I'm going to say it's something that is a point of constant dialogue that we and many organizations that are focused on this issue have with the companies.
Thank you. The Associated Press. So push it one more time to get it read. Okay, there you go.
My name is Brian Carvellano. I'm Vice President and Managing Editor of the AP. I'm here with my colleagues Karen Kaiser, who is the AP's General Counsel, and Ian Phillips, who is Vice President and Director of International News. I do have a question, but I just want to say real quick that we're here in solidarity with our colleagues at Reuters and at CPJ. We may be competitors, but we are all journalists. And when it comes to advocating for press freedom, we are partners. And we are here in support of Cha So-u and Wallone and all of the journalists around the world who have been wrongfully imprisoned. My question is, in the excellent Reuters investigation of Indin, names were named. Do we have any idea what happened to some of those folks? Have they faced any sort of justice whatsoever? And is there any hope of that?
There was actually an acknowledgement by the military that the facts that were reported in the piece were correct, and according to them, 7 people have been prosecuted for the crimes that were reported in the piece. We can't necessarily independently verify that second part, but it's striking that there are many denials of many allegations that have been made. But when it comes to this story, the government couldn't deny it because they said, it was overwhelming evidence. It was evidence not only based on survivor testimony, but also testimony from military people, from eyewitnesses, from local Buddhist villagers in Indin. So there was no way to really deny the facts. And actually the facts that were reported there have now been, confirmed in government reports where governments have issued sanctions and by the UN and others. So there was an acknowledgement of the truth of what they reported, and apparently there's also been some accountability, which would be a very isolated incident, if true.
Yes. Please don't forget to identify yourself. Thank you. Press that one more time. Yep.
Thank you. Katie Riley from Time Magazine, and my question is for Amal Clooney. I wonder, in light of the International Criminal Court's recent ruling that it has jurisdiction to investigate crimes by non-member states with cross-border outcomes, I wonder, do you think that development could have any impact on future involvement in this case or on justice for the Rohingya people in general? And do you believe that that ruling could be a turning point in the prosecution of crimes against humanity globally?
I think it is a turning point when it comes to this conflict. I think there's been sort of escalating measures. We saw yesterday that the Human Rights Council issued a resolution saying that following the work of the UN fact-finding mission on Myanmar, there's now going to be a team of lawyers and others who are going to build prosecution files that target specific alleged perpetrators. And I think the ICC is the other side of that, where they say, Myanmar is not a member of the ICC, but because Bangladesh is, and because there's been this mass deportation of over 700,000 people who've had to flee Myanmar to go to Bangladesh, they have jurisdiction over some crimes. So essentially it's the crime against humanity of forced deportation and then potentially associated crimes. That wouldn't cover all the crimes that the UN factually leads.
Okay, thank you. Evelyn Leopold, resident UN correspondent, and
Gail Gove, our general counsel at Reuters, is going to address that.
I mean, I think we've addressed all possible options at our disposal. We've had many conversations with many people around the world who are in a position to help us and to engage in quiet diplomacy, and we will continue to do that until they're free.
Thank you. Any other members of the media, if you can just raise your hand. All right. So at this point, I'd like to invite Margot Ewan, the Director of Reporters Without Borders in the U.S., to make a brief remark.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you to Reuters, to CPJ, to Amal Clooney for this wonderful event. We too, at Reporters Without Borders, stand in solidarity with all journalists in prison. I wanted to highlight that 56 professional journalists have already been killed in 2018, surpassing 2017 last year, and 697 have been killed since 2012's adoption of the UN Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. So the UN must actually take into account, as Joel has said, that in addition to deaths, violent threats against journalists, imprisonment of journalists is another popular method of silencing the news, silencing journalists from reporting stories that impact us all, and depriving us of our right to information. And unfortunately, many journalists who are in prison do end up losing their lives. They are subjected to horrific detention conditions. Sometimes they're released only to die months later because they were denied adequate medical care. We need to continue, as we are doing today, to raise these threats and attacks against the freedom to report and the right to information as we witness a growing hatred of journalists around the world, which unfortunately is not limited to authoritarian regimes. We are seeing democratically elected regimes also attack the press more and more frequently, which is why we need to continue to address wrongs as they occur publicly. And we need to underline that a free press is not an adversary, but an essential component of democracy. Unfortunately, as verbal attacks against the press grow, so do physical attacks. And we also need the international community not only to condemn, but to highlight and lead by example in their own countries by respecting the press, by respecting their right to report. We are very pleased with the steps that the United Nations has taken so far to strengthen its response to journalist safety. We ask them to go as far as possible by truly establishing an emergency response mechanism to prevent the loss of lives of journalists, and also to prevent journalists from being jailed and further silenced. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Could you please hit your button once so it turns green and raise your hand? Yes, here, in the yellow. And then push your button one more time so it turns red. Oddly enough, you can speak when it's red.
Hi, my name is Wasfia Nazreen. Although Dr. Shahidul Alam is a friend and like a father to me, my question here is as a Bangladeshi youth. When Dr. Shahidul Alam went out into the streets to cover the student protests that broke out, he was representing the youth. He came out to protect us. And then he was arrested, and then at the same time, he was not the only journalist who was arrested and beat up by pro-government activists. There were AP journalists and Reuters journalists, and it's all well documented. The current government also, while this was going on, introduced a new digital act. And while this is all happening in Bangladesh, our government, our PM was honored by the UN right in this very building yesterday, and she was given a humanitarian award by the IPS. And my question is to all of you, also to Amal Clooney, that how do we tackle this when the UN itself is endorsing her, and we of course appreciate her efforts into taking in refugees for Myanmar, and she deserves those accolades. But at the same time, what her government has been doing to citizens in Bangladesh, that needs to be questioned, and she needs to be questioned in the UN. Thank you.
Well, I think you really zeroed in on, in my view, what engagement from the international community has to look like. There certainly are instances in which governments deserve recognition and leaders deserve recognition, but part of the engagement has to be based around a critical principle that respect for the rights of journalists and free expression is fundamental. So if you are even if you have some positive policies that are being recognized at the same time that engagement occurs, there has to be a principled commitment to raise in a forthright and honest way the challenges, and that's what I often fail to see. And that's my criticism. I think the international community, when it engages through the UN, has to maintain a commitment to those principles, and often they're lacking.
I think that at a time when the world's governments are closing their doors to refugees, Bangladesh should be commended for taking in so many under such dire circumstances. But at the same time, I fully support what you say, that doesn't mean they get a free pass on any other violations they may be committing. Absolutely, they should be, other governments and the UN itself should be taking a principled stance on this issue. We know it doesn't always happen. We know it's highly selective. But I also know, when we approach a case like this, we try and use all the tools in our toolbox. So sometimes there's legal recourse, there's diplomatic recourse, there's financial recourse, and there's public recourse. And I think in terms of state-to-state pressure, sometimes states will say, well, quiet diplomacy is more helpful at this juncture, and sometimes they'll be public about it. So, of course, when they say quiet diplomacy, you have to make sure it's quiet diplomacy as opposed to doing nothing. But there comes a time when you can't really be quiet anymore, and people should be speaking out. And I absolutely agree with you. The UN should always be doing that when it comes to press freedom matters.
I see a question from Nancy from the Tahrir Institute.
Yes. Thank you so much. My question is regarding Egypt. CPJ has already recognized the level of unprecedented repression that Egypt has on journalists and bloggers. The issue is, and we've seen what has been happening in the arrests of people who are well-known and award-winning, like Wael Abbas. The issue is not just the people who are being imprisoned, but also the institutionalization of repression with new laws that we see being issued very frequently, like most recently the cybercrime law and the media law. And I was wondering, other than the international rights groups, what could international credible media like Reuters and others could do in order to put pressure on the Egyptian government to stop such crackdown? Thank you.
Well, I'll let Steve, if he chooses to, answer for Reuters. But I mean, it's not the role of the media who are covering the developments in Egypt to necessarily change the policies. But I think that all media has an obligation to report on the developments that are occurring there and to inform readers, and that's a challenge. It's a challenge for two reasons. It's a challenge, first of all, because the Egyptian government has adopted an increasingly aggressive posture, this goes back some time, towards the international media. So it's more and more difficult for international journalists based in Egypt to work without fearing for the safety of their staff and worrying about direct interventions from the government. The other challenge is the kind of global media landscape where, developments which are incredibly noteworthy, we have to acknowledge, like what's happening yesterday and today in the Senate Judiciary Committee, but sometimes it's it's less significant events like President Trump's latest tweet, and so they drowned out some of that essential news coverage that I think makes it easier to hold governments that systematically violate rights to account. So that would be my answer. I don't know, Steve, if you want to add anything.
Well, the only thing I'd say is we have a big commitment to reporting in Egypt. I don't have the number at my fingertips, but we certainly have more than 30 journalists, including many local journalists, reporting in Egypt. And despite the fact that I'm here today advocating for our own reporters, we're not an advocacy organization, and we think we do the most good by reporting as well and as hard on the ground. And we have a big commitment to reporting there what's happening in every aspect of what's going on in Egypt, and I think that's fundamentally what our role is. So thank you.
Can I just add a good news story, which is that I represented a journalist who was imprisoned in Egypt a few years ago and subsequently helped to get him released. And he's now become a very enthusiastic human rights activist, and actually yesterday was outside the Myanmar embassy in London protesting in support of Wallon and Chesau, and has become someone who calls me every 2 weeks telling me all the new cases I have to take on. So, when you do get them out, they can become very valuable partners in these kinds of cases.
I see a question over here.
Thank you. Hi, my question is for Amal. I wanted to ask you about something you touched on earlier that I found really jarring. You had mentioned that in your dealings with the Myanmar legal system, you suddenly went from expecting the presumption of innocent until proven guilty to having to prove that the opportunity for a crime that they had claimed was not in fact possible. And the question is, how do you navigate this? Like, how do you work within a country that doesn't necessarily practice or enforce its legal system in the way that you would expect it to in the UK?
Yes, I mean, I gave you one example of that in the judgment. It actually runs throughout the whole judgment. It's the only way a judge can draft a document and end with they're guilty is to flip the burden and constantly say, well, yeah, this prosecution witness did actually confirm the defense case, but 10 others didn't, so I'm just going to discard that. And it was that level of sort of absurdity of reasoning. That is what we're dealing with, which is why we are appealing to the executive branch now to remedy the injustice. You know, one can't have high hopes for higher level courts to remedy when matters that are as fundamental as the presumption of innocence are not respected. It's also why we have hope that Aung San Suu Kyi herself would wish to get involved to remedy the case, because she has spoken so frequently of the need for the rule of law, for the need for respect for those kinds of processes. And, you know, she has said one political prisoner is one too many. So we're hopeful that since these are the principles she has herself espoused, that she will step in and try and correct the injustice in this case if indeed the courts can't do it themselves.
Question over here, sir. Please remember to identify yourself.
Yes, I'm Alan Dodds-Frank with a contingent from the Overseas Press Club of America, and also speaking for the Press Freedom Committee of the Society of Silurians, another New York journalism group. And my question is, in addition to the normal letters we write to the regimes ordering, asking them to release imprisoned or persecuted journalists, have you identified anybody in the current United States administration to whom we should also be addressing our concerns? And would it be helpful to urge that our home countries exert economic pressure on Myanmar to release these journalists?
Actually, all branches of the US government have been supportive of this case. So from the White House to the State Department to the mission here, Ambassador Haley and her team, the Treasury has imposed sanctions on a broader basis on Myanmar. Military aid has been reduced through the Department of Defense. So, and actually in Congress as well, there's been some bills introduced and which have bipartisan support. So I think the US government has actually been quite engaged, but of course, you know, all countries in the world could be doing more, whether it's through bilateral sort of negotiations or any other measures that they think can be taken that would move things in the right direction. I mean, remember, Myanmar was a success story a few years ago, and the idea is that releasing these journalists would actually set them back on the right track towards, you know, a society that respects the rule of law, a society that's moving towards becoming a full democracy. You know, that's what we're trying to encourage the government to do, and any partners that we can get diplomatically to help with that are obviously welcome.
I do want to add to that by just saying, you know, it's extremely positive that the U.S. government is engaged in the Walon Kwasau case. We obviously would like to see more consistent engagement around the issue of journalists in prison. We don't see that. And it goes without saying, because we've been outspoken about this, that we think such engagement would be more effective if the president were not constantly criticizing the media and what we believe to be, not really criticizing, attacking the media and undermining the media in a way that we view as inappropriate.
Straight up here, ma'am. Yes, you. Please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Fernanda. I'm a journalism student at NYU, and I'm asking this as a journalism student and also as someone that grew up in Brazil, and where since there's been a lot more violence and just straight up hatred towards journalists. And so my question is, in your experience, can you tell if there's anything that we can do to prevent violence and to prevent things before they get to, you know, physical violence or cause a journalist to be jailed or even killed? Do you think that there's anything that we can do regarding prevention? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very important question. I think one of the big challenges we face around the world now, and I'm sure Joel will want to build up on that, is big journalism organizations do a lot to attempt to protect their journalists. Obviously, you're not 100% successful, but big journalism organizations have security advisors. They put people through hostile environment training. They sometimes have security advisors go ahead and actually scout out places where the journalists might go. They provide them with security equipment. with sat phones when that's appropriate, with helmets, with bullet protection, and that often is extremely successful, and all the big journalism organizations in the room do that. I think the big challenge we're facing in global journalism right now is there are so many freelancers out there, and in part because of the sort of the undermining of the economics of journalism, there's just a lot of people out there without a lot of support. And I know that journalism organizations like CPJ and others are getting much more involved in the journalism security world, because it's just so dangerous for people to come out of journalism school, immediately go someplace dangerous and try to do journalism. Those are the people who are getting killed the most, in addition to local journalists. And maybe I'll turn it over to Joel to talk more about this.
Yeah, I think one way to look at it, the one way we look at it, is there's a kind of information ecosystem. It's not just about the role, but it starts with the kind of local working for international news organization and includes the support staff. So there's this whole infrastructure of information that we really depend on, and even the major international organizations, as Steve will acknowledge, some of the stories you get you can't cover a vast and complex country with a bureau. You really need to feed off the local. So you have to take a sort of holistic approach to protecting all the journalists who are participating in this process. And we have we obviously advocate for journalists when our work, which is we call our emergencies program, and provides support are threatened or imprisoned or victims of violence. But we have
to say I've been working with Reuters and the General Counsel in particular, her team, for many months, and they have stopped at nothing to help their journalists and to make sure that they can get out of prison and go back to doing the work they do so brilliantly. These journalists are young and they are brilliant, and they should be worrying about whether or not they're going to win the Pulitzer Prize, not whether they can get out of prison anytime before 2024. And I have to say, they're lucky. They've had some very bad luck, but they have good luck in working for Reuters, an organization that has their back, and I know won't stop working on this until the day they're released from prison. So.
Thank you. We'll take one or two more questions for Shamima.
Mine is more of a comment. I'm Shamima Khan. I'm the cousin of Shahidul Alam. And first, I wanted to say we did a protest yesterday, a demonstration for Free Shahidul. I'd like to thank CPJ and many others here who've really supported us on this, co-sponsored us. Thank you so much. A couple of things that we wanted to say very much is that the pressure on the government do have to be kept up, because we are very worried about this sort of attrition. Every time that there is a bail hearing, it is denied. Every time there is a bail hearing, it's the end of the list. Shahidul goes to court. He stays there for a couple of hours. He is told that, oh, it's the end of the list. The day is done. This will be heard another day. This has been going on for a while. And these are the kinds of things that kind of tend to take attention away over time. And as, other things come up and people don't stay focused on one issue forever. So I do want everybody to think about member states of the United Nations and others in your own capacity in your bilaterals. Ask our Prime Minister, what's going on? What's up? What's this I hear? Every time she turns around, I would like to hear somebody say, just explain to me what's going on. And I think that alone brings up quite a bit of momentum and attention to this. And it becomes difficult to avoid that question every single time. So we really need for the international community to keep the pressure up, because we are in it for the long haul, and we hope that the haul doesn't get longer. Elections are upcoming in Bangladesh. We're very worried that Shahidul will not be let go of before the elections are ended. And you as journalists everywhere should be worried about that, because your voices are not simply your own. Your responsibility is to amplify others. Shahidul has established Pathshala, which is a training institute for journalists. So it's not this generation of journalists only. He is looking at who's going to follow you. So please keep up the pressure on our government. You can't compartmentalize. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have time for only one more question. I see Ellery Biddle from Global Voices.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Steve Adler a question. So Joel was just talking about the importance of a media ecosystem and how there are so many people working for small outlets or just blogging or doing journalism on Facebook who do not have the unique advantage of working for a big, powerful Western media institution like Reuters. And whose names, we might not even know, or who certainly wouldn't come up in a session like this. And so I'm wondering if experiences like this for Reuters and for other big media, does it make you think more about covering threats against journalists working at that really local, hyper-local level, and how important that is to ensuring that they too get some visibility that can be so critical to them being able to continue to do the work they do?
Thank you for the question. I think over the last, 7 years that I've been in the role, I've thought a lot about what our broader responsibility as Reuters can be towards journalistic safety beyond just the people who are, literally on our staff. And a few years ago, you're probably familiar, there was a very good effort led by David Rode to put together a set of agreements so that big journalism organizations would commit to essentially treating freelancers the same as their own staff. And so we were, I think, the first signatory to that. And so we go way out of our way to make sure that the hundreds of people who we work with who are not necessarily on our staff are getting the exact same protections. And if our journalists anywhere were freelancers, we'd be doing exactly the same thing we'd be doing for staffers, and including providing them with hostile environment training if they're in those environments. We've also provided some hostile environment training to freelancers who are not our freelancers, just who are people out there who are needing the help. So broadly, I agree that organizations with resources and are everywhere in the world do have a broader responsibility, and I know my colleagues at AP and others care very much about that as well. I take your point that we do try to cover press freedom issues wherever they happen, whether or not they're about our own people. I sort of reserve the right to put special advocacy at work when we're trying to get our own people out of prison. But I think you make a good point that all journalism organizations should be watching out for those issues everywhere in the world and pointing them out and putting attention on them. And I think that's a very good point, and thank you for it.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add to that. I mean, CPJ, Reporters Without Borders, the many other organizations that work in this arena. Part of our model is to make that easier, honestly, by investigating violations committed against local journalists or journalists that might not be on the radar, ensuring that we have a lot of credibility. So when we say these are the facts, that resonates with international media organizations. And so we're not making news judgments, and we're not making decisions about what are stories and what are not stories, but we're certainly trying to put this information in front of news organizations in the best possible frame, so that when it is in their judgment a news story, they're able to cover it. And I do want to say that I've seen over the years, when that happens, and it's challenging, because we know what we know what the news cycle looks like, and we know what the competing demands are of news organizations, and we know that news organizations don't want to be accused of special pleading. Those are challenges. But when they do cover these kinds of violations, governments take note, and it puts a lot of pressure on them. It also moves the diplomatic community. It changes the nature of engagement on that level. So it's a powerful tool. It's one that we try to mobilize along with our many other colleagues who do this kind of work. And so I recognize that this is always the kind of day in and day out work of an organization like the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Thank you so much to everyone for coming. We really appreciate your support. You have the hashtags to use in your advocacy, and remember that if you see a petition, you're wearing a button,